What do you imagine happens in that tomb of Jesus that creates the Shroud of Turin and then has him then walk around and in this kind of spiritual body, what Paul calls the spiritual body?
Yeah, one of the differences between the rainbow body and the shroud is precisely the image. All right.
Yeah, right.
So the people who have and I've interviewed some of them. I interviewed Emmanuel Marinelli, for example, who was one of the leading researchers on this. I read the book, The Burst of Conscious Light. He doesn't accept it as a religious shall we say, a cause of religious faith. But he does accept it as truly the burial cloth of Jesus and that Jesus had this extraordinary ability.
Wow.
He tries to explain it in terms of basically a very high degree of ethical and spiritual development in the case of Jesus. Okay. Now let's think about that for a moment in the light of other research that we have now, thanks to neuroscience and other studies of the structure of the human cell. There is something called biophotons.
Oh, right. Biophotons. Yeah.
Okay. So each cell, as part of that cycle that I was studying back with Dr. Wu at the Boyce Thompson uh, Institute, the cycle of respiration, assimilation, and so on that goes on inside the cell is directed, we usually say, by the DNA in the nucleus. All right. But then we have, and we all become experts in mRNA, thanks to the vaccines, right?
Right. Right.
So from the DNA, the mRNA goes out into the cell nearby the mitochondria and directs the process of generating proteins. Now, there is another factor in all of this. There is a pulsation of light energy that comes out of the nucleus that helps guide this process, that helps to energize this process. And these little tiny bits of light are called photons, biophotons. And they have been known since the 1920s. This is not something that was just recently discovered. And even there are therapeutic procedures that have been devised in some European laboratories and clinics for using biophotons to restore the biological equilibrium of a human being who has been ill. All right. Now, in 1997, somebody did a really interesting experiment, which is exactly the experiment that I said back in 1918 ought to be done. It
Mm.
had been done, a few years previously. I only found out about it afterwards. It was picked up, so we're talking, like 18, 20, 20 years later, 20 years later, by a French news service. Basically, what was done was people who were practicing the Sufi Muslim remembrance of God practice, the zikr practice of reciting the names of God rhythmically in a deep state of contemplative awareness. All right, these people were tested for their biophoton output.
Mm.
Now, the output was extraordinary, like hundreds of thousands of times higher than normal.
Mm.
Not just like 1%. It was gigantic, of people just doing the names of God and adoring God, in that state of awareness.
Mm.
Nobody followed up on this. And it's an experiment that definitely needs controls, follow up, a full fledged lab, and the whole story. Nevertheless, it does suggest to us that the body in a state of contemplative awareness, praising God, adoring God, engaged in contemplative prayer, actually heightens a biological process that goes on in each and every one of our cells. All right. Now, flash our way back to in time travel to Jesus himself, who has already manifested the body of light to his disciples on the Mount of the Transfiguration. Right? He knew how to turn on the light bulb. You know, he
Yeah.
knew this from his own inner experience. At the time of his death, he who was in touch, of course, by our faith, we know he's the logos of God. He's the one through whom all things were made.
Right.
Why is he the one through whom all things were made? Because he knew how it all works, even better than the angels, because the angels in classic angelology are on that side of the spiritual creation that can see the way things are made, right? They admire God's work. But here we have the one who did the work, the one who is a demiurgos, right? The one who is the word, the Sophia of God, who has created this universe. And so he turns on the light bulb of primordial energy, and rises from the dead and leaves his image on the shroud. Okay, so the shroud confesses atonement, and it confesses the identity of Christ as the incarnate logos. All right,
Wow.
it's powerful.
So
Think,
amazing.
granted, you know how we poets and theologians are. We can overstep our bounds, but we're reflecting also as men of faith.
Yeah.
I mean, why would anyone believe that? And it's said at least 4 times in the New Testament that Jesus is the one through whom all things were made. All right. Why would early Christians say that off the top of their heads? It's so contrary to, certainly a Jewish ethos to say that of a human being.